Hey, if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. I've been inviting listeners to check out other episodes, and I'm also trying to get people to recommend episodes to their friends. Our audience is growing, but I think we can do even better. I've also been thanking people who leave a review in Apple Podcasts, like this guy, Josiah Gibbs, who gave 5 stars and said, hey, give this show a listen. You may find your own family's okay after all, even when you don't think you quite fit the mold. All right, thanks for that review, Josiah Gibbs. And I hope more people will follow in your friendly footsteps. Go to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Or if you're listening in Spotify, you can rate the show. Without further ado, on with the show. This episode includes brief discussion of suicide and suicidal ideation. Listener discretion is advised. If you're struggling, please reach out to someone you trust. You can also call or text the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. The number is 988.
I love being part of something that came way before me and will be continued long after I've taken my last breath. I love the feeling that a space has been made for me and that I might make one for someone else.
As a black woman growing up in England, Catherine Joy White sometimes felt out of place at home and also disconnected from the place of her ancestors. She longed to feel part of something, and she began to find strength in the stories of remarkable but forgotten black women from history. As an actor, writer, filmmaker, and scholar of women's history, Catherine started collecting these stories to re-envision what it means to be a black woman today. These forgotten histories have things to teach all of us. Catherine Joy White joins us to talk about her new book, This Thread of Gold, a celebration of black womanhood. I'm journalist Blair Hodges, and this is Relationscapes. Catherine Joy White, welcome to Relationscapes.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I want to begin where your book begins. This is a story that I think helped inspire your book's title, This Thread of Gold. And it's a story that sounds like a fable. In fact, I actually Googled it like right as I was reading it because it's true, but it seems so fantastical to me. And it's a beautiful metaphor. Take us to the island of Sant'Antioco, where a woman is pulling treasure from the sea.
I mean, even hearing you say those words, it's kind of like, is this a children's story, fairy tale? But there is really a woman. She is named Chiara Vigo, and she is the last remaining woman on Earth who pulls byssus from the sea and weaves it into sea silk. And not only is that in itself this kind of beautiful, magical thing, but it's steeped in this amazing tradition because only women are able to do this. And they pass it on, so mothers to daughters, aunts to nieces, they pass it through the generation, this kind of craft of how you dive, get the byssus, and how you then harvest it to make sea silk. And I heard of her through a friend of mine called Kitty McFarlane, who's an amazing singer-songwriter, and she'd written this song about her called Sea Silk. It's an amazing song. And I just got fascinated in her story, started trawling through all of these interviews. And, you know, the other amazing thing about this is it cannot be sold. And Kitty has this line that keeps going through her song, like, it can't be sold.
Yeah.
And I think there is something about this that just stuck with me. And I found out about her 7-8 years ago now. And I'm just fascinated by this story. So when I began writing the book, this was always in the back of my mind, what that represents for womanhood, I suppose.
Yeah, the thread being kind of this connecting lineage of remarkable people that you're going to be introducing us to in the book, and then also tying it to your own personal stories. And so your book is really digging into fascinating and important women, black women in particular from history, and then you're connecting them up with things that you're experiencing in your own life. So this thread of gold is woven throughout history, and you feel it connected to yourself. And then it also kind of, you're thinking about how it's going to be projected out into the future as well.
Absolutely. And I think that was really interesting to me in the process of writing, because I didn't set out to write anything that was personal. You know, this book started
Really?
Honestly, this is, yeah.
Wow.
This, you might be surprised, but this book actually started life as my master's thesis. So I was studying women's studies at Oxford.
Okay.
And I wrote this kind of, it was quite radical for them, because the way I pitched it was I want to write my dissertation on Beyonce. And of course, all of the Oxford academics were a bit, you know, I don't think so. But actually what I was writing about was how black women used food as a means of resistance. So I started with the kind of Aunt Jemima figure and traced that through history to Lemonade, Beyonce's album, which came out at the time, the year that I was writing this dissertation, 2016. And that for me was a really interesting and kind of novel way to look at what resistance and how resistance has traditionally been acknowledged in the academic space. And I wrote it as a menu. I'm always quite a creative in terms of how I like to disrupt form as a writer.
Yeah.
But so that was how this book started. And then I broadened it from food and thought, okay, how do I look at resistance through the lens of celebration and empowerment and uplift? But there was this kind of sense that there was a connective tissue that was missing, and there were all of these women and they were amazing. And, you know, I started it in this sort of like chronological way, and that didn't feel right. It just felt quite academic and dry.
Yeah.
And then I was trying to find other ways of bringing them together. Okay, so what if we have sort of the politics here, and here we have the arts, and that didn't feel right either.
Right.
And so I was going through this
themes,
whole, it just didn't, it felt like an academic exercise, and that wasn't what this book was. You know, this is a book to connect with as many people as we can. So eventually I kind of realized, well, what is it that makes me the person to be writing this and makes me the person to be doing it now? I guess it's how I interpret what these women have done, or these women around me, because we also look at contemporary figures, some of whom are even my own family. And once I kind of had that in my mind, I mean, there was a whole process. Am I ready to write about myself in that way, I suppose, you know?
Yeah.
Which maybe we can get into later.
You really put yourself out there. You put yourself out there a lot in this book. And yeah, as you say, we'll talk about it as we go. But I think it's really special to have someone who's doing history put themselves out there like that. I think there's a place for the kind of academic stuff you described, right? Like we need that kind of research, that kind of straightforward stuff. But even historians can't help, I think, but apply it to themselves, apply their research to themselves as they go, at least in their own heads. One of the reasons we do history is to find things that are either really relatable or so foreign that we learn something new about ourselves.
Yeah. And of course, we're dealing with real people. History is the study of people and ways of living and being. And I think it would be remiss of me to kind of treat these women as though they exist separately to me, because the point of the book is it's about what connects us. It's a book about connections. And I do feel really excited now that it's out there in the world that it's not just Black women who are coming to me and saying, you know, I feel seen, I feel held. It's white men, it's Asian women. It's a book that speaks to something greater than just the lives that have been lived. It's kind of about what we take from those who've gone before us and what we pass on to those who are coming after us. And I think that has been so exciting for me to begin to get this kind of response from people, because that was what I dreamt of. I always said, I don't want this to be just for us. I want this to be a book that brings people in and says, look at us, like, look at the breadth of our humanity.
That's why I was so excited to do this interview, you know, as a white guy in Utah, to dig even further into Black history, which is something I've been trying to spend a lot more time with the past probably 4 or 5 years. And so your book is great because it injects that personal into these historical figures. And I thought maybe we'll start off by having you just read a really short excerpt from the beginning here that highlights what the thread of gold is. And this is on page 6 and 7.
Okay, sure. Okay. For centuries, Black women have been overlooked, downtrodden, and dismissed. They've been sexualized, racialized, and ignored. Culture has often portrayed Black women as a monolith and in terms of victimhood. And yet, what we have not seen, still do not see enough of, are the real women behind the stereotypes, radically resisting being spoken for. Throughout this book, I draw together stories of women many have never even heard of, who have quietly, and by any means they could, resisted the grasp of dominant narratives intent on their erasure. These women might not have been prominent in the contemporary sense of how we understand power and what it is to have a voice, but they have led lives of determined resistance. In reclaiming their individual acts and voices from the cultural narrative that for centuries would rather suppress them, this thread of gold will make these women visible, in some cases for the very first time. The world will see them rise. This thread of gold travels through time, visiting workplaces, film sets, literary salons, churches, and kitchens. We visit places where resistance took place in whispers, from mother to daughter, about the art of the possible, where it took place so quietly and subtly that you could be forgiven for not even noticing it. And indeed, most people didn't. But also where it happened loudly, exuberantly and on a global scale. You will meet Black women from Europe, Africa, America, and the Caribbean, dating as far back as the 18th century. You will discover how these women have used art, the media, politics, food, deadly weapons, and any other available means to challenge the dominant narratives about Blackness and womanhood, and to offer alternative and assertive visions for both. Black women are not victims. Black women are alchemists, spinning gold from lives of hardship.
Beautifully written, and I really appreciate how it highlights that this isn't some book of tragedies. You talk about difficult things, but you also want to highlight Black women surviving, thriving, and glowing. Those are the words that you use. And so it's important to talk about the hardships. But I think so often when people think of Black history, they just think about the most tragic and difficult tales, which need to be told, without maybe focusing enough on the joy, the exuberance, the artistry, the power, the resilience. And so I love that your book is trying to center those things as well without papering over. And you're not using it to say hard stuff doesn't exist or that we shouldn't focus on it at all, but you're using it to say this is a fuller story to include the joy.
That's exactly it. I started off thinking as somehow I'm painting and I'm filling something out, bringing brighter colors to the surface. But actually over the sort of process of writing it, I began to feel a bit like an archaeologist. I felt like I was finding things and pulling them out that, for whatever reason, we know the reason, it hasn't suited the kind of dominant narratives to preserve these kinds of stories. Some of them, we know the story of Rosa Parks. Wherever you are in the world, probably you've heard of Rosa Parks, but there are these very few figures that kind of make it to mainstream. And I sort of question why that was. And that, I read more about Rosa Parks, and then I discovered that she wasn't the first woman who gave up her seat on the bus. That's no shade to what Rosa Parks did, amazing hero of our times. But there were women who came before her who didn't suit the narrative. They were too young, they were too dark-skinned, they were a teen mother, out of wedlock, all of these things. So it was really also about giving grace to some of these women and saying they also existed, and how can we celebrate their lives alongside some of the figures that we already know so much about. We can't just exist in this space where we only have room for 1, 2, 3 figures.
You're talking about the chapter Grandmother, and this is where a lot of these women are heroic in many ways, but they're also human, and you're grappling with that in this chapter called Grandmother. You're kind of asking the question how we can revere and learn from our elders without being tied down to what their limits are, right? And so you're bringing up Rosa Parks, and like you said, most people recognize that name. She refused to stand up on the bus. But you say, her story's even been domesticated a little bit. Like the story you might see in a children's book is there's this nice old lady who just got on a bus one day and just decided, like, I don't want to move when they tell me to. But she was an activist. Like, she was ready to do this, in part because there was someone even before her, as you just mentioned. Let's talk a little bit about Claudette Colvin, because you introduced her to me. I hadn't encountered her until this book. So who was Claudette Colvin before Rosa Parks?
So Claudette Colvin was 15 years old, and she was on the bus with her school friends, and it's a very similar story.
Yeah.
The bus filled up, and the driver asked Claudette and co. to stand, and Claudette didn't want to. And the other thing that's fascinating about Claudette Colvin is that the civil rights movement, didn't use her because she was from the wrong side of town. Mm-hmm. She was pregnant and she was 15 and she wasn't married and she was dark-skinned. So she was kind of seen as someone who was, I guess, illiterate and wouldn't be the right face of the movement. But when she speaks about that time, she said that she felt the women that she'd learned about in school speaking to her, pressing down on her shoulders. She speaks about Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, abolitionists. And this is not a 15-year-old girl that isn't thinking about the world around her. This is not an illiterate girl. This is an intelligent young woman who could have been the face of the movement. And I do believe that, that saying, walk so someone could run. I think she walked so Rosa Parks could run. And it breaks my heart. Even now, so many of us have never heard of her. She's still alive. So many of us have never even heard of her. I think there was, some talks. There would be a movie about her. Like, her story is becoming more well known. But I think we could pick anyone on the street and say, have you heard of Claudette Colvin? And we would probably find, very small percentages. So I wanted to just open a dialogue on that. Young people also have the potential. We will be the ones who will go on and change the face of the earth. And I think not to dismiss the power in that quiet protest that doesn't come from the most educated voice and the palatable figure, I suppose.
Yeah, and you seem sort of sympathetic. Like, you quote Rosa Parks herself, who knew about Claudette Colvin, who said, like, they would call her a bad girl and her case wouldn't have a chance. People would talk about her pregnancy more than the boycott. So you talk about the strategy that was involved, and you seem like to be a pragmatic person that kind of gets that. But also you say, like, but also isn't it a shame that this more marginal figure has been erased, or that they couldn't find a way to maybe hold hands together and elevate both things? Like, you're kind of critiquing the elders, but you're also kind of understanding the circumstances too. It's like many things are true in the way that you tell the story, and it's complicated.
I think that's exactly it. And it's about recognizing the complications. I understand why at that time Rosa Parks was a better face for the movement that already was faced with so much resistance than Claudette Colvin. I understand that. But we now have the benefit of hindsight. We're all these years later, and Claudette Colvin is still airbrushed out of history. And I don't see why that is the case. And I think it does take books like this, where we're sitting her right next to Rosa Parks, right next to Shirley Chisholm. Let's put her in context with these amazing figures from history and give her the credit that she deserves, because there's no reason for her to still be dismissed. It doesn't make sense to me.
We'll meet some more of these people as we go. I wanted to talk about your chapter called Silence. This is actually the first chapter in the book, and it's a kind of a funny way, an ironic way to open the book with something called silence. And you talk about how you started to kind of, as you got older, lose the vivacity of your childhood. You were really vibrant, a dazzling child, really outgoing, so it makes sense that you became an actor. And yet you say that's also when you started to shrink back into yourself and started to lose your voice, which is the opposite of what someone might expect to happen. Is you're coming out on the stage, you're ready to perform, and this is when you kind of start to retreat into silence. What was happening in your life that caused that?
Yeah, this chapter is really important to me. I, as you say, was the most confident child I think you could ever imagine. It made exact sense that I would, go to a life of performing and being out there. But as I kind of went through life and met, various authority figures, I started my job working at the United Nations, and I kind of moved into certain parameters where there was a mode of being. I began to recognize that the way I present as a Black woman, at the time as a young Black woman, with this level of confidence, didn't necessarily sit comfortably with everyone. And so I found myself in professional settings, in personal settings, being told to be quiet, to dim myself. And you don't recognize that at the time. Of course you don't, because I think you're young and you're forming yourself. But at a later date, when I sort of come through the other side of something that perhaps we get into later, harmful relationship, began to kind of look back on some of those times, and I recognized that it wasn't just self-inflicted. I had actually been silenced by people who purported to have some sort of position of care or authority, and I began to question why that was. And around that same time, the incredible Michaela Cole was on stage collecting her Emmy, and she had this speech where she said, "Don't be afraid to see what comes to you in the silence." And this was at a time where I was lost and I felt voiceless, and I'd gone from someone who felt like, actor, United Nations worker, setting up my production company, world at my feet, first class degree from Oxford, to floundering and thinking, I don't know that I deserve to be in any of these spaces. I'm recovering from various events in my personal life. And then I felt like Michaela Cole was speaking directly to me. So it felt really important to me to open the book with silence, because I wanted anyone that picks it up to understand, no matter where you're coming from. If you're coming from a place of joy and confidence, that's going to be fine. You'll receive that. But if you're coming from that place where I was, it's about already setting the groundwork and saying, don't worry, this is a space for you. And this book is going to hold your hand and take you through this tapestry of recreation, reclamation, and resilience, and get you out the other end.
And there were a lot of factors that helped you recover your voice and find your volume again without leaving silence behind either. It seems that there's seasons for silence and seasons to be vocal. But the person that you highlight the most in this chapter who helped you kind of think through the recovery of your voice is unexpected. It's a woman who used to be on the pancake boxes across the country, Aunt Jemima. More specifically, the woman who portrayed her, Nancy Green. So talk about how her story and her example helped you think through the idea of silence.
So Nancy Green was the first time I started to feel like I'm an archaeologist here. I'm finding this. So Aunt Jemima, the figure, will be familiar to most Americans. She sat on top of pancake boxes for more than a century. So she kind of emerged out of the slavery era. So there was the mammy figure, and then she transformed into this kind of smiling woman with a headscarf on her head. And she would sat on top of those boxes as most Americans had their breakfast. I guess the figure of serving food and, you know, working selflessly, making families happy with no thought for herself. But there was a real woman who was behind that figure that nobody has ever heard of. Her name was Nancy Green. She was the first Black corporate model in the United States. She was also a founding member of Chicago Baptist Church, and she had this incredible life. And years later, when she died, she was laid to rest in this unmarked grave. And nobody knew anything of her. And it was only kind of around the 2020 era when suddenly people were sort of saying, okay, Quaker Oats, maybe it's time to acknowledge that you profited from this woman all of these years, because they finally made moves to remove the figure. It was only in 2020, by the way, that they made that announcement. And the question sort of, okay, what happened to the real Aunt Jemima? So there's this amazing woman called Sherry Tucker who went on this journey to unmask her grave and eventually found her lying in this unmarked grave, tried to lobby Quaker Oats to, I don't know, do something to acknowledge her. And they said, you know, Aunt Jemima and Nancy Green are not the same person. Whereas, of course, they had benefited from her figure for all of those years.
Yeah.
Regardless of that, as I say, this isn't a book to look at oppression. I was kind of just wanted to celebrate the real Nancy Green. You know, this woman lived and she was a pioneer in her own way. And she, at one point, without most Americans knowing it, was one of the most famous women in America.
Yeah, and she showed you a kind of courage. She also showed you that she wasn't going to bend too much to make herself too palatable, right? This is one of the lessons that comes out of this chapter for Nancy Green as an exemplary figure. Maybe say a little bit about that, like the specific lessons that you learned from her, that you took from what you found in history.
Yeah, I think that whole process, who was Nancy Green, I also then kind of looked at poetry and songs and what was going on at the time. And there's some amazing kind of, reclamations of, you know, there's an amazing poem called Aunt Jemima on the Pancake Box. And there are these kind of almost protest songs, it feels like, that, you know, she's driving her car and she's, you know, free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last, because she got sick and tired. I mean, maybe we could even read a tiny bit of that, I don't know, but it's just this amazing sense of, she refused to be silenced, but those around her also refused to allow her to be silenced, and they sort of wrote her back in to history through art. So yes, there's this smiling, meek figure behind this mask of contentment, but what if we imagine her life and we write that into existence? And I think that's also a really powerful metaphor for all of us when we find ourselves faced with a situation that we can't change. We just rewrite that, whether it's only for ourselves, but it's something about the autonomy and empowering sense of being able to just change that course of history.
Yeah, the poem here, there's a part where it says, Aunt Jemima got tired of wearing that rag wrapped around her head. She got tired of making pancakes and waffles for other people to eat while she couldn't sit down at the table. And then the poem ends with with saying, Lincoln emancipated the slaves, but she freed her own damn self. The last time I saw Aunt Jemima, she was driving a Mercedes-Benz with a bumper sticker on the back that said, free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. So yeah, this is like taking her off the box and making her a real flesh and blood person that kind of took control of her own life.
Yeah, I just love that. I think, you know, the box as well is such, I mean, she was physically trapped on a box, but that's such a powerful image, I think, as well, you know, for where I found myself at that time and where I know so many of us, not just Black women, find ourselves boxed in. And this,
Well, we'd rather put some people on a box, right? Like, we don't need to hear from you. Like, you're supposed to just stand in as this cipher for something that we want to feel, right? People don't want a flesh and blood person.
No.
They want a model figure, right?
It makes us feel more comfortable to say, okay, well, I understand you if you are within these parameters, therefore that's where you must stay. Even, listening to your They, Them, Their podcast, it was exactly that same, feeling that we don't necessarily understand pronouns and identity. So therefore we want to just put people in one space or another because that makes us feel more comfortable.
Yep.
Whereas of course there are a huge diversity of identities and we need to be able to acknowledge that without it threatening our own identity. What does that say about us,
Yeah. See, and this is the brilliance of your book because you take us to this chapter on defiance. You've kind of led us through silence to defiance, and you point out that a lot of women have had to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously as men, not just in the workplace, but in contexts like the civil rights movement itself. So you want to celebrate the civil rights movement, but you want to reckon with some of the difficulties that happen within the movement itself. And this is especially the case for Black women who you say have almost been expected to demonstrate the superhuman strength. And for people who haven't heard this before, maybe give us some examples of what that looks like and why Black women are expected to be kind of superhuman.
Yes. I mean, I think this firstly applies to all women or, people of diverse gender backgrounds. So I think you need to be doing the invisible labor. So you're often working a job and you're dealing with the invisible work that's in the house and the childcare. But then when you get to also being a Black woman, you are seen as strong before you are seen as human. So therefore that means that you are not able to express pain. So that shows up in all sorts of ways. That shows up in the maternal mortality statistics where Black women are more likely to die in childbirth. In the context of the civil rights movement, you had the Black Panther food program where the men were sort of the people who got all of the acknowledgement, but the women were the ones who kept that food program alive, and they were the ones who were preparing the meals. I'm actually just finished writing my second book, which is on food, and went through so many interviews with these women. There are hilarious interviews where they're laughing. I didn't even know how to cook, they're saying. Some of these eggs that we're making had eggshells in them. Why were the women the ones relegated to preparing the food? That's the question that we need to ask ourselves. They were the ones behind the scenes, working harder in a way than some of the men and being taken half as seriously and also not reaping the benefits in the same way.
And expected not to be complaining or crying or showing like weakness either, right? There's a sense that they just have to have this appearance of like that resistance and resilience means strength. And you pointedly say, actually, resistance and resilience don't always have to mean strength.
Yeah, and I think that was another point where it kind of came back out to me, and I, faced with this question, how brave, I suppose, do I feel here? Because I was at the same time faced with, in a completely different way, this idea of always needing to be the strong one and, working 6 full-time jobs and doing all of these other things, being the one that's there for everyone else, never thinking about breaking for a second until, in fact, at the point of writing it, I think I wrote, I danced with the danger of burnout. And unfortunately, it did come and I did get severely burnt out to the point where I was unwell at the start of this year. And I wish that it didn't have to get to that point. I wish even though I knew that in my head, I wrote about it in my book. I sort of knew it was coming, but I sort of thought, it doesn't matter, I've got to keep going. And again, that lesson for me came from an older woman who I stayed with in Guadeloupe, who I worked with in Paris. And she challenged me, and I remember it still to this day. Also, I write about this. She just said, what is it you feel you have to prove?
Yeah.
And I couldn't answer her. I still couldn't. And I think that's a question that I am grappling with as I'm, thankfully great now and doing so much better. But I've had to take stuff off my plate and I've had to really ask myself this question, what is it I feel I'm trying to prove? And if there's not a valid answer that comes to mind, then maybe it's time to reassess who and why and what is making me live this way.
Yeah, and one of the exemplary figures that you point to in this chapter that can help teach that lesson is Diane Abbott. And for people that haven't heard her name, she's the first Black woman elected to the UK Parliament. and she's also the longest serving Black MP in the House of Commons. She has kind of been viewed as this really strong, incredible figure, but has also been besieged by brutal criticism. And people here in the United States might not be familiar with the dynamics of the UK. So maybe give us a little bit of the background about why Diane Abbott, we might have a stereotype of England abolished slavery before the United States did, right? So they must be just ahead of the game, and racism's maybe not as much of an issue there as it is here in the United States. I mean, here we see police killing Black folks much more often. Like, there's stuff in the United States that make us look to England as kind of this more exemplary place, I think.
Wow.
And you're complicating that picture.
I mean, it's super complicated. Diane Abbott is, as you said, she was the first Black woman elected the House of Parliament, the longest serving Black MP, full stop. And she is really popular with her constituents, but at the same time, she receives over half of all of the abuse sent to MPs, full stop. I included one tweet, but you don't have to look far to find some of the horrific things she faces: death threats, rape threats. It's truly, truly brutal. And anytime she makes a mistake, which she does because politicians make mistakes, she is honestly hung out to dry in the press, in the media. And in fact, she has, until very recently, been stepped down as an MP because there was a whole situation with something she'd said, and she wasn't supported by the Labour Party. They've now given her back the whip, and she is now standing we've got a general election coming up, and she is now able to stand. Mm-hmm. Even last week in the press, there was a whole controversy over her not being allowed to stand, and people had to go out on the streets and protest for her to have the right to stand. The Tory party's biggest donor, which is our Conservative Party, was caught on camera saying, "Doesn't Diane Abbott just make you want to hate all Black women?" This was last month in the press. So she's kind of faced this trauma, relentless, consistent trauma for being Black, for being a woman, and whatever else people were bringing into that. But what I wanted to focus on in the book is how she just kept on coming through. And in the last general election she increased her majority by a really significant amount. And it was just sort of this, a fly kick in the face of everyone who was saying this woman doesn't know what she's doing. She does. And I think that was an amazing moment. But I speak about her in the context of strength. And she did this one interview. Because the thing about Diana as well, she keeps quiet and she just keeps on going and keeps on doing the job. So I think that enables people to keep bringing her all of this brutal criticism. But she did this one interview and she just spoke about, I mean, of course I'm strong, but that doesn't mean this doesn't affect me. And it was around the time she was speaking about in the context of when Meghan Markle was also receiving similar abuse in the UK. And
this is what opened my eyes to what was going on over there. It was
right.
Unfortunately, it took something like Meghan Markle to be like, oh, maybe all is not well overseas here.
All is not well overseas. It's really not. Yeah. And I think that's another really beautiful example of how, as Black women, we support each other. So that is going on with Meghan Markle. It's then that Diane Abbott, after 30, 40 years in this game, speaks out and says, listen, this affects us. We are humans. And I think that was really powerful to me because there is a real sense that we need to recognize humanity, and that can mean strength. But strength can look like so many different things. It doesn't mean an inability to feel hurt and an inability to cry. That's a really harmful stereotype. And so I wanted to disrupt that by showing the other ways that strength can exist and what that looks like. So that's actually one of my favourite sections in the book, that section about Diane Abbott. I'm really, really glad it's in there.
Yeah, it's this interview in 2017, this quote from her. She says, people always talk about strong Black women, and I'm sick of hearing that because everyone's human. And contrary to what you've heard about strong Black women, even strong Black women cry. And for you to read that, because you also felt like you needed to be this strong figure, and like this gave you, it's almost like it gave you permission to say, actually, yeah, it is okay. And I do cry and I do hurt. And I can embrace that instead of trying to put that off or ignore that part of myself, or maybe even feel ashamed of it.
I think that's absolutely it. And I think I was very conscious writing this chapter. When you've achieved, and I'm saying this in quotation marks because I know in an audio podcast, a certain number of things before you reach the age of 30, people might look at you and think, oh, well, it was different for so-and-so, or oh, XYZ meant that was possible. And I wanted to be really honest that has come at a cost. And I don't think I would have said that if I hadn't found this quote from Diane Abbott and dived kind of deeper into her life and what Meghan Markle was going through at the time as well, and just recognise that Diane Abbott expressing that enabled me to express that, and I think will enable somebody else to recognise that in themselves, that we don't have to be strong all the time, and even on paper achieving, accolades and certain things, it doesn't mean all that much if you are not safe and well, and understanding how to protect yourself, because in doing so we also protect others around us. So yeah, I wanted to kind of open that space for that side of things as well.
Yeah, and again, to point out how this book is more broadly applicable, I think this gets into discussions about masculinity and about expectations about men being strong and wanting to feel ashamed of crying or not being able to embrace the vulnerabilities that come along with any human life. And so you apply it really well in the context of the stereotypically strong Black woman who in reality feels and needs to feel and can cry. And I can apply this to men who need to tap into that emotional side of themselves and feel permission to feel and to be vulnerable and to cry. So it's a principle that can apply in so many different areas.
Definitely. It's so important, because I think in the same way that we have a responsibility to each other as Black women, or, Black men have a responsibility to us, I think we also need to recognize, how our actions, even me speaking out, might enable a male friend to be able, feel able to do the same. That's my hope. That's my dream. I lost a close friend to suicide during the pandemic, and that's something that I'm hyper aware of. Layers of privilege there. In some ways, it's perhaps easier for me to speak about suffering with any form of mental health issue than it is for a Black man to do the same. There are layers to it, and it's really complicated. So I think just opening the space is really important.
That's Catherine Joy White. We're talking about her new book, This Thread of Gold, a celebration of Black womanhood. She's an actor, writer, filmmaker, founder, and CEO of the award-winning Kusini Productions, which is a company that helps champion the voices of Black women. She's a gender advisor to the United Nations and has been honored as one of Forbes' 30 under 30, and also earned a master's degree in women's studies from the University of Oxford. So an incredible resume here, Catherine. Let's talk about reinvention. This is a chapter I really enjoyed. It introduces us to Hattie McDaniel, who was once the most famous Black actor in Hollywood and the first Black woman to win an Academy Award. And this was back in the 40s,
Black person.
Oh, the first, so just the first Black person in general. And this was like back in the 40s. And you point out how she was caught between white Hollywood's expectations for the kind of roles that she could play and some folks in the Black community feeling like maybe she was selling out or that those roles were stereotypical. So she kind of faced this catch-22 of like trying to be a successful actor, and also people saying like, well, she's just kind of up there tap dancing, which is, really problematic too. So this all came to a head as she was going to be in the film Gone with the Wind.
Yes. So this, I think Hattie McDaniel, which you can tell if you read the book, she sort of gets almost a whole chapter to herself, whereas everyone else, we kind of bring their stories together. So I got completely obsessed with her. And I think perhaps it's not surprising, she's an actor. She was also one of the first ever producers. So when she was a young adult, she set up McDaniel's sister company, which was a production company, a Black female production company, something I went on to do, centuries later.
Yeah.
So I think it makes sense that I was drawn to her. But like most people, the version of Hattie McDaniel that I was familiar with was the woman who played Mammy in Gone with the Wind, which I and most people viewed as a very stereotypical, derogatory, potentially harmful role in terms of furthering the way that we would want Black women to be perceived on screen. But, I start diving deeper into her because at the same time, she has this incredible resume. She actually played over 300 roles, was actually credited for only 83 of them. And she was the first Black person. I also used to think she was the first Black woman. She was the first Black person ever to win an Academy Award. So I started to dive a bit deeper into her life. And I discovered that she had just had this extraordinary way of just keeping on going. So by the time we get to the point of Gone with the Wind, she's been a well-known figure for years at this point and has, acted in so many different roles and has already been facing criticism because, of course, the roles that she was playing were maids. She has that really famous quote, I'd rather play a maid and make $700 a week than be a maid and make $7. So that in itself shows you something about the kind of woman she was. But I also recognize that for the majority of Black women who were not Hollywood actresses and actually were maids, that's quite tricky.
Yeah.
But so by the time you kind of get to Gone with the Wind, and this is a really iconic role that everyone is looking for. So famously, Eleanor Roosevelt even submitted her own maid for the role. It was a really coveted and sought after role, and McDaniel got it, which she was really happy about. But that kind of clashed. It totally clashed with where society was at the time. The book was offensive in many ways. The black villains were kind of black, and the N-word was used a lot, and the KKK was somehow seen through rose-tinted glasses. It was a really complicated role, and the NAACP at the time were really angry, along with the whole black community, that she would consider taking them out, and they were sort of protesting in the streets, trying to get her to stop that. Meanwhile, the white community sort of embraced her as their palatable figure. Well, here's the good, this is a quote, the good Negro, this is kind of this is how it should be. And she just kept her head down, and famously the N-word wasn't actually uttered by her in the film and it was in the book. So there's a lot, she never confirmed this, but there's a lot of thought that she actually fought to have that removed. But what I thought was just so kind of incredible about her was watching her acceptance speech. So the film went on to be a huge hit. She was a success. She won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. And you watch that speech, it's on YouTube. And she just gets up there. She was banned from the ceremony. They had to fight to allow her to attend. She was able to sit at a table on her own at the back. It's devastating. And she is allowed to go to accept her award. And she just says, she thanks God. And then she says, I hope I will always be a credit to my race and to the motion picture industry. And I think, she's holding back tears. And in those words, I see what this meant to her. And I think, again, it's something that with the benefit of hindsight, just as with Claudette Colvin, now we can see, we understand why Rosa Parks was the figure, but, we see why Claudette Colvin needs to acknowledge. I think there is so much quiet power in what Hattie McDaniel did. Aside from all of that, she was a sex icon. No one knows this. She was married 4 times. She threw a deathbed party. So as she was dying, she invited people to her deathbed to toast her with champagne with her favourite flowers. She often connected her work back to those who had come before, She really said, she spoke proudly about wanting to glorify Black womanhood. And I think the kind of movement at the time needed her to be one thing, and she couldn't offer that because she had her own journey that she was on. And I think that journey has opened the doors for so many of us to be doing the things we're doing now. Admittedly, we still have far too few Black women who have won Academy Awards. The numbers are incredibly low, but she opened that door by showing us that we don't have to be defined by one thing.
You're reclaiming her not just for people in general, but also Black communities who have kind of forgotten about her. And you want to make sense of the tensions that surrounded it, the difficulties of, the kind of roles that she played, but also the defiance and the courage and strength that she showed in paving a way, like making a way in Hollywood for Black actors required compromises. And that kind of sucks, but it's also the reality. So you're trying to say, we don't have to just completely forget her, throw her under the bus, or just view her as someone who sold out, but as someone who did the best with what she had and can actually be an inspirational figure who we can still appreciate the complicated elements, but also celebrate what she was able to achieve as well.
That's exactly it. And it has been really gratifying meeting people, so many people this past week since I've been out in New York, just saying, I didn't know that about Hattie McDaniel. Yeah. All I ever thought was, sell
Mammy.
out, mammy, exactly. And it's, them looking further into her life. And I think that's the best thing I could hope for from this book, is that you kind of get a flavour of some of these women, and then you go and research further. And then, the further you get with Hattie, she also was an amazing activist. She desegregated housing in LA where she lived. She wasn't just a sellout. She was quietly just working to do whatever she could. And I think that to me is, it's all I could hope for with this book, that it will encourage people to look deeper and to look further, because there is no one single story, which is what, how I start that chapter with Hattie Daniel, Chimamanda Adichie talks about. The problem with a single story is not that it's untrue, it's that it's incomplete. And it's, for me, I'm saying, how do we fill in the blanks? How do we complete the picture, or at least start to?
And this connects to the idea of identity formation in general. And you have a chapter called Formation, where you're reflecting on feeling disconnected from your own Caribbean heritage as a British Black woman.
Yeah.
And I wanted you to read from this chapter so we can talk about it a little bit. This is on page 88, and we'll talk about identity construction and why that's been a little complicated for you.
Okay. Identity construction as a Black woman is a difficult and sometimes painful process, and I am no stranger to how lonely it can feel when you try to go it alone. There is no blueprint for who we are. Our history isn't typically taught to us in school, or at least not beyond the bloody and demeaning history of slavery. I certainly didn't grow up seeing an empowering past on television or in the books I read, and believe me, I searched. Searching was precisely what I was doing during the summer I discovered a book that would change my perspective and everything I had previously thought about what it meant to be a young Black woman. It was towards the end of my stay at Jacqueline's when I stumbled across French Caribbean writer Maryse Condé's Victoire, my mother's mother, translated from the French Victoire, les savoirs et les mots. I was looking for a book that I could read in French that would connect me with Guadeloupe during the rest of my time there, before I headed farther afield to Martinique, to St. Lucia, St. Martin, and finally, the motherland, Jamaica. I wanted to connect somehow with my mother and with the world she came from. This was where I found myself when I picked up Victoire for the first time. Ostensibly on the trip of a lifetime, I hopped from island to island seeking the answers to my past and therefore to my future. I went to the Caribbean expecting to reclaim something fundamental to my sense of self, to fill in the missing pieces in the puzzle of my life, to belong and feel instantly at home. It wasn't as straightforward as that. While I felt as though I belonged on a superficial level, I taught myself Creole, my skin was golden, and I spent my evenings dancing on a tropical island under the stars, there was something missing. As far as the Guadeloupeans were concerned, I didn't belong. I was a British girl in the Caribbean, an English tourist, holidaying in a place that was not and would never be mine. This felt like the ultimate rejection. If I couldn't belong in Britain, the place of my birth, and I was such an obvious outsider in the Caribbean, the islands I came from, then where did that leave me? Where did I fit into this story? Who was I?
And the strange thing is, one of the ways you found out who you were is through cooking. And I say strange because some people might think that's stereotypical, that cooking is women's work. And here you are, a strong feminist figure. And so you kind of had to wrestle with that too. Talk about how cooking played a role and how you started to make sense of that to also resist the stereotypes of women needing to go back to the kitchen because that's where their real selves are.
Yes, this was one of the most surprising and complicated things I grappled with. But so I kind of journeyed across the islands of the Caribbean. Mainly I was staying in Guadeloupe working, and then I did this kind of island hop ending in Jamaica, where my aunt, a sister of my mother's that I'd only met once as a teen, lived, and I was staying with her. And there was something about being in that space suddenly that already made a difference. I wasn't just, someone going it alone trying to figure out. I was in a family unit, but, we were very different. I was figuring a lot of things out at that time, and she was very kind of quiet and methodical, and she's a lawyer by trade, and I think we were different people. But the place we came together was over meals, and I kind of realised that, that was a way to sort of begin to connect, like asking her, what's this? How have you done this? going to the markets with her. And eventually one day I just asked her, would you teach me to cook like you? And she really liked that. And it became a little kind of ritual, I suppose, where we came together and it didn't really matter about whatever else was going on. That was a space where I began somehow to learn about, yes, food and how to cook it but something more personal, because of course when you're absorbed in an activity like that, the space opens for wider conversations. And I began to get to know her, and I began to get to know what her life had been, and by default began to get to know more about my grandparents and my mother, her sister. And that was the most significant and incredible thing. But then I'm suddenly in this space where I am in a very traditionally gendered space, learning about, family units and women. And it was a really complicated thing. So of course, me being me, I then go to, all of the books I could find, and I look for examples of other women who have done this and find ways to kind of grapple with it. Is it only gendered? Can there be some form of reclamation and recreation, which is the chapter, the part of the book that's in these spaces? And in Victoire by Maryse Condé, I found this incredible story. It's of her mother's, Victoire, my mother's mother, so it's her grandmother, who brought her family out of slavery, servitude by cooking. And she cooked her way up the echelons of society until she got her daughter to the best school in the country, and her daughter was able to go over to France. And, she uses food not only as a way of uplifting her family, but also as a way of forming self-determination. She writes that her grandmother in the kitchen, she's God. It's her. And she has this parallel between cooking and writing, which for me was, well, it was everything I needed to sort of go running with this. Because of course you are. When you're cooking, you're creating, and you are starting from scratch, and you are bringing something to life. And it doesn't need to be gendered. It's a sacred and safe space, but it's also a space of creativity and fusing things together that you wouldn't previously have considered would go there, and also then the political ramifications of that. So I had this, kind of revelatory experience by just a simple question. It all started from that simple question, and by the end of that trip, I'd somehow discovered a whole lot of things about myself that I didn't even know I needed.
Yeah, and again, I would say this is something that like more men could, or people who, non-binary folks, people who aren't stereotypically supposed to go to the kitchen or whatever, can also take a page from this and say, wow, that's an amazing place of creation that maybe I want to get into. I mean, I'm not a great cook. Partly it's because our kiddos have the most bland palates with like three meals that they'll eat. So part of it's just like, we're just trying to survive. And I kind of wish I never had to worry about food ever. That would be nice. But it's inspiring to me, and it makes me want to be like, okay, I want to get in the kitchen and like figure some dishes out and experience the kind of creation that you described. So yet again, I think it's another example in your book where it doesn't have to be just gendered. I think we should pay attention to the gendered components of it, but it can stretch beyond that, and it can be a stretching experience for anyone who wants to experience the kind of growth that you did when you reconnected with your heritage through cooking. So I think it can apply to a lot of people.
Definitely. And it's that challenge again to complete the picture. Just because you think something exists only in a certain way, let's look a little deeper and let's pull that apart and let's question why. Yeah. And let's see what exists in those spaces. I challenge all men to get in the kitchen.
Yeah, we need to find that thread of gold too. We need to kind of be connected to that thread, and we can through different practices. We're talking with Catherine Joy White about her book, This Thread of Gold, a celebration of Black womanhood. Let's talk about your chapter, Warrior. It's one of my favorites here, and you start off in a hairdresser's where there's this little child that comes in and delivers a really powerful forward speech. Her mom probably has brought her in here, and she's defiant about it and just says, "My hair is nice." And all the women around were just like, yes, and like affirming her. And like, I love that you said that, because Black women in hair, it's been a thing. It's been a real thing about what hair needs to look like and the beauty standards surrounding hair.
Yes. This is also, I think, my favorite chapter. Yeah, it was the most difficult chapter to write also, but I think it's the chapter that brought the most healing, and I think brings the most healing perhaps. But yeah, I think, that tiny momentary sort of situation in the hairdresser, I was just looking at this girl, as we all were, and it immediately cheered her on when she sort of, she was hiding behind her mum, and she was really refusing. She did not want to have her hair done that day. And of course she didn't, because who wants to sit in the hairdresser for hours? As a black woman, braids, weaves, relax, whatever you're doing, you will be there for hours minimum. And it hurts. I remember the pain of it as a little kid. I think I got all of that, but it was her choice of words. It wasn't just that I don't want to, I'd rather be playing with my friends or whatever else she could have said, which would have been equally as valid. It was that my hair is nice. And the way that we were all so quick to just say, yes, it is. Because who wants to say to this little girl that your hair is anything other than nice? I mean, it's the first time I've ever made this connection, but just saying that now, I'm somehow wondering if it ties back to the idea of the voice being taken as life comes at you. And that little girl she's so pure still, and she's so untainted by all of the things that the world wants to throw at her. And I just think, I hadn't really made that connection before, but certainly that interaction got me thinking about beauty standards and about, wider kind of connotations of self-care, which I then, again, being me, started researching and realised that, it's become this thing, self-care. I'm going to take myself...
Self-care, hashtag,
right? And it's such a sort of trite way of belittling something that really it has its roots in quite in politics. And I traced it back to Audre Lorde and her sort of writing about caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And then how am I reconciling political warfare with hashtag self-care, drinks with the girlfriends or whatever? So I wanted to challenge the way that we look at self-care now, and recognise that, here's little 5-year-old girl coming in and saying, my hair is nice. We owe it to her to recognise that. And if we're going to force her to get her hair done to fit a certain beauty standard, we need to understand why. And, getting deeper into Audre Lorde, as she was writing that, she was actually grappling with the cancer that eventually killed her, whilst also, fighting the fight of being a black, queer woman. She was writing about self-care because she needed self-care literally to stay alive. So I think there's a real kind of reconciliation that needs to be done there. And, she then speaks about this term of overextension, which just spoke to my soul. Again, it's around this time of burnout. And what does it mean if we're overextending all the time? It led me to just wanting to find a solution that isn't a solution, but I wanted to I looked at animals, what do animals do? And I just wanted to find a way that we could survive. And that did take me to the hardest part to write, which was, this relationship that was violent, and how I suppose, brought myself out of that through the words of Audre Lorde and Nina Simone. And I don't know, it's...
You hinted at this a little bit earlier, this difficult relationship, and I wondered, maybe describe it a little bit, and people can check out the book to kind of get the full story, and then talk about what it was like writing about it and deciding to include this in the book. 'Cause it's a really vulnerable thing that you did.
Yeah, it was a big thing to write about. And there was a real back and forth about whether that would even be the right thing to do. But I suppose what I wanted to do was talk about creating structures of our own. And I think, we start with the little girl, and the reason she needs her hair to look a certain way is because structures that are not of our own making say that. And you take that kind of further. And I think it was about how we can find safety in forming our own herd. I was looking at different animal communities, and this sort of relationship that I had when I was, in my late teens, early 20s, turned violent, and it wasn't something I was able to really deal with at the time. And in the process of writing this book, I spoke to my best friend, who's been my best friend ever since, and asked her if I ever spoke to her about this and what I said. And she just said that I shut down and she couldn't get it out of me, and we only spoke about it after the fact of the situation. But, you know, we had many nights where she'd seen the bruises, but she couldn't speak to me about it at the time because I was somehow walled up in this sense of needing to protect that person, needing to protect myself, or not wanting to acknowledge that. And
yeah, this is like a self-care that's actually burying something. You're not actually caring. It's a shallow surface level self-care of like, maybe I can have a couple drinks, or maybe I can focus on something else. Like, this is a self-care that didn't actually process. The survival type of self-care needed to dig down into what like really happened, and maybe even find a way to talk to people about it.
It's exactly that. And I think I certainly don't blame myself. It's something that I'm only just beginning to, you know, even talking about it is in this kind of surface way, I suppose, is deeply uncomfortable in many ways. But that was part of the thinking in wanting to include this, and I wrote it, and then I was like, there's no way I could put that in. But then,
do you feel shame around it? Or like, where is that coming from? Like, what is that? Because some people would say, well, going there is just painful, and if I go there, I feel things I just don't want to feel. Other people might say, it's I feel shame about it. Like, where is it coming from for you about talking about an abusive situation you were in, and like why that's hard for you?
I think it's because my whole being, and honestly, my general demeanor is joy. That's my default. And I think there's something about knowing and speaking about that happening to me. And then I guess I have this feeling of, well, that shouldn't happen to someone like me, because I know about, like, this is what I do for a living. You know, I guess it is shame, and it's also a not wanting to process it. I think that very much still hasn't fully happened. This was the start of it, and just putting that there. And of course, so many women have connected with that and spoken about what it's meant to them just to see that there.
Yeah, that's the self-care that you're pointing to here. Is
exactly.
Like, we need to support each other. There's choice feminism, right? You talk about choice feminism. It's this sort of rise of like, everybody choose your own way. And like, it's very individualized. It's very capitalist. It's very corporatist. It's boss babe. It's like strong women, whatever. And you're like, we need a solidarity feminism. We need a connective feminism that really connects us to others, and where self-care isn't about buying yourself a new shirt. And sometimes that's fine. Go ahead and buy yourself a new shirt.
Yeah.
Like, you're not saying like, you're not anti-treat yourself per se. You're saying, yeah, you can do the treat yourself thing, but it's also got to be more than that. And like, so you're inviting people to connect by being able to share stories so that you can take down those walls, and then you can start integrating it into a new story that includes the pain, that connects to that thread of gold, that's also powerful and empowering and joyful, so that it's just, you're not just isolating it off in your brain. It's like, this is the thing I'm just going to shove under the rug. And you're saying, no, I need to find a way to integrate it into my story. And if I'm going to do that, I have to connect with other people to do that.
It's exactly that. You have expressed that so perfectly. And I think this is the point, the thread of gold, and this metaphor of the tapestry that runs through the book and beyond. This is a book about real people. This is my life. It exists outside of the words on the page. And I think it's about recognizing that no matter how dark the situation in question is, you can find the gold in it, and you take the thread and you pull it. I'm using the metaphor, but the metaphor is what keeps me going. It's the optimism and it's the faith that things will get better. And that is what I believe is speaking to people so strongly with this book. It's about finding the gold no matter what your circumstances, and weaving it into your narrative. It doesn't have to be buried. It's all part of our individual tapestry and the collective tapestry, which was how this chapter ends, in the way that I just find so, even now when I read that, I cry, because I just interviewed 50 different Black women about, the chapters started about kind of beauty standards. So I asked them about beauty, but of course what ended up happening was that we moved way beyond surface level beauty. I asked them, what does beauty mean to you? What do you find beautiful about yourself, and what do you do to embrace your beauty? And it was just so beautiful the way that people responded, and that to me is something that we can all encourage ourselves to question in ourselves and in others, and you'll be amazed at what comes up.
People talk about finding their energy beautiful, finding the caring that they do as beautiful. Women saw themselves as being thoughtful, as being connected to their ancestors, as being warm and accepting. And you also do make a point, though, and this is really important, that not everybody has to be a public pioneer. Like, you're not saying in order to process a traumatic experience, you need to publish a book or you need to write about it to huge audiences. You also say they're private pioneers too, and stories that will never will recover because people keep them in small circles or keep them to themselves. And so you also make space for private pioneers, not just like the hero out there pioneers, which we need. We need those exemplars. You have found strength in them too, but you also tip your cap to people who don't need to be out there that much, but find a way to connect to the thread of gold.
Exactly. And I think, again, that's prefacing the book with silence, just to remind everyone, like, as you go in, we're going to look at a lot of loud, bold figures because those are the figures that I guess traditionally make history, but that's not the only way. And I looked at, video gamers and Muriel Tramis, who kind of designed the skin tone modification for The Sims and things like that. These are women who probably no one has ever heard of, and they're sitting in dark rooms coding.
Yeah.
And that's bold and that's brave and that's brilliant. And that actually was feedback, I think, from one of my sisters, just said, what about those women who aren't so out there? And I was kind of like, oh yeah, that hadn't occurred to me. It really hadn't. I was focused on the women that went out there loud and proud and made a difference. But actually, these women are just as important and valid. So I think that I'm really glad is in there, and I hope that speaks to people who would never dream of writing a book and putting their personal life in it and all of those things. They're just as valid. They are just as golden and important.
Well, Catherine, there's so many stories in the book that we couldn't begin to even cover them all. There's Alice Deering, a swimmer. There's Stagecoach Mary. There's so many people that I want people to meet in this book, this thread of gold. But let's return back to the story that we started with, The Golden Thread from the Sea, and Chiara Vigo. I thought I would have you read from the epilogue here, if that's all right, to close things out.
I wonder what Chiara Vigo thinks of as she dives down to the bottom of the seabed each spring. I wonder if she looks up to where the sunlight catches the waves in tantalizing ripples, a reminder of the world waiting just above the surface, just out of reach. I wonder if she basks in the silence of the world under the sea. Is this world a sacred one, removed from the noise and the chaos of life up there? Or is she eager to return to land, thinking of her mission, to preserve the secret of womankind and deliver it to generations still to come, generations still unknown, unheard of? Does she float in the sparkling azure sea, freed from any pain? Is she weightless in that water? I imagine her to be weightless. The very process of retrieving the sea silk and beginning the weaving of what will one day be a vivid, exuberant tapestry, loosening the shackles that hold her. I love my blackness. I love my hair, my food, my music, the brotherhood, sisterhood, family, and community. I love being part of something that came way before me and will be continued long after I've taken my last breath. I love the feeling that a space has been made for me and that I might make one for someone else. Most of all, though, I love the legacy that has been left. Stories just waiting to be uncovered by anyone who takes the time to look. The excavation, the uncovering, the delicate crafting of this book, honouring lives this world owes so much to, is both a source of pride and an exercise in consciousness raising. We must stand united in our mission to lift these women's names out of obscurity, to herald them for their achievements and contributions. This is just the start of the unveiling of Black women's stories and lives and the heady, exhilarating, resilient threads of gold that we each bring to our shared tapestry. In every possible way, our strength is in our unity. We are weaving this together, and the growing tapestry, though it will never be finished, is an incendiary call to arms, an exhibition of a collective resistance that rises together across countless differences. Let us hang it somewhere prominent and think on it when we next opt for silence, find our elephants, declare that we are enough, or even quite simply say no. Let us remember that we are as connected to a rich historical legacy as we are to the rapidly unfolding new narrative.
That's Catherine Joy White reading from This Thread of Gold, a celebration of Black womanhood. And Catherine, before we go, I always like to do a segment called Regrets, Challenges, and Surprises. And your book is just coming out, so I'm curious to see how you'll answer this one. If there's anything you would change about the book now that it's out, or you can speak to the biggest challenges that you faced as you put it together, or you can talk about something that surprised you most in the course of writing it. You can pick from any of those options.
I think my answer probably is a regret linked to a surprise. And that is, there are so many women that I couldn't include. And, you know, every day I discover someone new or meet someone or just think, oh, I wish that you could be in the book, or wouldn't it be amazing if this could link to this? And that somehow has felt frustrating because, of course, the book is now written and it's now out. It's, I think, 1 week today it's been out in the world, so I can't change that. But I think that has been also a really nice surprise because the metaphor of the tapestry holds up so beautifully in relation to that, because I think the point of the book is that it will never be a complete finished work and we should all keep adding to it. So I think actually the surprise is the people who in a week since it's been out coming to me and saying, I actually went away and researched and I found out about so-and-so, and did you ever think about including her? And I haven't even heard of her, I say, but how amazing that you are now looking at her legacy and story, and you're probably going to talk about her to someone else. And somehow the book keeps growing and the tapestry keeps being added to. So I think that would be my answer.
Yeah, the metaphor is it's just perfect. It's rich, and it really makes sense of a meditative book, a book that you take us in and out of your own life and the lives of the women who you've drawn inspiration from, some of them much more known than others. I really appreciate the work that you put into this, and just the basic power and strength of your voice. You're such a good writer. You really made me want to learn more too. So thanks so much for not only writing the book, but coming and talking to us about it.
Thank you, Blair. Honestly, this has been amazing. Your questions are so thoughtful and nuanced, and it's really a joy to get to dive into the book like this. So thank you.
Thanks for listening to Relationscapes, where we're mapping the stories and ideas that shape who we are and how we connect with each other. If you're enjoying the show, please go to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. It just takes a minute. Or even better, if you're in a safe place to do this, text a friend with a link to this episode. Don't keep it all to yourself. I mean, if you don't like the show, send a link to your enemy. Take your revenge. All right, Mates of State provided our theme song. Relationscapes is part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. I'm Blair Hodges, and I'll see you next time.